came a long way from St. Louis. You climbed the ladder of success. I've seen the flashy foreign cars that were parked out in front of your fancy address. You came a long way from St. Louis.
Yes, we did. We have come a long way from St. Louis. Around the country doing commercial news talk radio in the most recent years, becoming known as the Radioactive guy. And here we are on YouTube on the Radioactive Take with Brian Steibel. That's me, commercial news talker from way back when. Worked at the mighty WJR in Detroit. You may have heard me up in Motown, propagating conversation at the speed of light at 760 kilohertz on the Superstation. It was called Open Lines for Open Minds in those days. When I got to New Mexico, it was Radioactive Albuquerque because it's the birthplace of the nuclear age, of course, and we just had the anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki this week, so that's been on my mind. And we worked most spectacularly up at the mighty Cairo, not Cairo, Egypt, Cairo, Seattle, K-I-R-O, at 710 kilohertz. And here we are, narrowcasting on YouTube in 2023, most specifically the 10th of August, a Thursday, as we continue in this rather unsettling century. I actually happen to prefer, with all of its genocide and misery and all the rest, I prefer the 20th century to the 21st, but I'm kind of stuck in it, and so are you. So let's try to make the best of it as we kick around the news and offer some thoughts on various topics in and out of the news, and also a little tribute to our crooner there of our theme song, the late, great Perry Como. We'll have a story about him in about 8 or 9 or 10 minutes, whatever it works out to be. Won't be a long edition of the Radioactive Take with Brian Steibel because, we don't want to overload you with my particular perspective on the cosmos, especially since we can't, at this point, take calls yet. At some point, if we can grow this podcast, narrowcast, whatever you want to call it, if we can get an audience of a substantial amount, we'll transition to one of the live platforms, maybe on YouTube, maybe one of the competing live platforms. There's a variety of them available to us. And then we will take your calls, because that's what I do best on talk radio, interaction with the callers. I'm not much for monologues. And a dirty little secret is hardly anybody else in talk radio is much for monologues either. They just think they know how to do it because they heard Limbaugh with all of his success, and they think that's the way you do talk radio. Well, maybe if you've got the talent of a Limbaugh, but nobody else ever has. If you got that kind of talent, then you can monologue. But otherwise, go to the phones when you got callers waiting. That was always my philosophy. And we'll try to uphold it, if only in a monologuing fashion here on the Radioactive Take with Brian Steibel over YouTube on our own personal channel. If you want to subscribe, that'd be great. Email comes to radioactiveseattle@gmail.com. As we take a look at the news, I'm sure you've seen the pictures out of Hawaii, Maui, a good portion of it at least, in the northwestern precincts of the what I was surprised to learn is the second largest island of the archipelago that constitutes the state of Hawaii. Everybody knows the Big Island is the biggest, hence its colloquial name. It's just called Hawaii, but everybody calls it the Big Island so as to not confuse it with the state of Hawaii. And it turns out it's bigger, Maui is, than Oahu, where Honolulu is, and where the bulk of the Hawaiian population is. But that in no way diminishes the plight that the residents of at least the northwestern precincts of Maui are experiencing. The pictures are just stunning. That town, Lahaina, is now Well, it reminded me of the pictures of Dresden after it was firebombed by the Allies prior to the end of World War II. I mean, it's a complete loss, and the death count's already up to 36, but that's going to climb. There's something like 200 people they fear may be missing. So all we can do is wish them best of luck and hope they can get this crisis under control. We also had the space shot. The Virgin Galactic organization under Richard Branson had a lottery and awarded a couple of tickets to go into a suborbital jaunt into the cosmos. Not unlike what Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom did back in 1961. Yes, I watched both of those launches at Kennerly Elementary School in suburban St. Louis. The principal was far-sighted enough to realize that was something that we could be talking about decades later, maybe on a YouTube channel. I doubt he had that much vision, but he did congregate us all in the auditorium there at Kennerly. All the grades, and we watched first Shepard go up and come back safely, and then Gus Grissom, and then, of course, John Glenn, the first orbiting American. And what these folks in New Mexico were doing wasn't quite as ambitious as what John Glenn and Yuri Gagarin and everybody else that orbits do, but it still gets you weightless for a few minutes. And as they reported in the post-launch or post-return to Earth press conference, it was the experience of their lives. And who can blame them? It must be something to feel weightless. I can't imagine. I don't even fly anymore. I quit flying in 1996 for more than one reason. But originally because I was medically grounded. But there's additional reasons I have just stopped flying. And you might say, well, then how do you get around? Well, via automobile, with me driving like a grandma. I drive unapologetically like a grandma because, by definition, grandmas live to a grand old age. And I do see America, the entirety of the lower 48. Haven't been to Hawaii and haven't gotten up to Alaska yet. That almost happened when I was up in Seattle, but it never did. But the lower 48, I have explored quite thoroughly. And we'll be telling you about our visits to all kinds of different places, including Perry Como's grave. That's connected to how we'll wrap up this edition of the Radioactive Take here on YouTube. But we also have to mention the sad assassination situation down in Ecuador. Presidential candidate, I believe he's the president. They don't have a prime minister down there, I don't think. And I don't even know that he was odds-on favorite to win the top job, but he is now DOA after, you saw the footage from Quito, the capital of Ecuador, named after the equator, which runs right through it, of course. In Quito, the capital, he was ambushed by a cadre of assassins who, for the most part, got away. They tossed some grenades to distract those in pursuit, and while they did manage to corner one of them, and he's as dead as the fellow who was assassinated, Fernando Villavicencio, I think is the way it's pronounced. So 2 bodies so far, one the victim and 2 one of the assassins, but there's a bunch of others that are on the lam, we're told, and we hope the authorities can catch up to them, and we certainly hope this is not a harbinger for a period of instability in that South American country. And as for the footage, I mean, let's be straight here. It's not the Zapruder film. You can't really see much as they're hustling him into the pickup truck, I guess, that he met his maker in. And we just, well, who can feel good about something like that? Certainly not Robert Kennedy Jr., who's now running against Mr. Biden, who, of course, has memories of his own father's assassination, as well as his uncle, JFK. We'll see how that goes. Actually, I've made a prediction. I've thought that maybe, just maybe, RFK Jr. will be able to be victorious in New Hampshire, just as Eugene McCarthy was over sitting President Lyndon Johnson in 1968. And that's why Johnson bowed out in March. He saw the writing on the wall, and that opened the way for Vice President Humphrey to eventually get the nod from the Democrat Party. We'll see what happens in this election cycle, and we'll be talking about that as time goes on this, the Radioactive Take with me, Brian Steibel, propagating conversation to whoever happens to be tuned in the YouTube universe here on the 10th of August, a Thursday in the late summer of 2023. Let's talk about the Perry Como thing. It should be obvious why we've selected that as our theme song, because yes, indeed, I've come a long way from St. Louis, doing my talk radio thing around the lower 48 and now settling in the sunshine state of Florida. I was in Jupiter a few years ago. Jupiter, not on Jupiter. Nobody's been there yet, although who knows, we may live to see that if we make it to the century mark in 2054. I was in Jupiter, Florida a few years back, and I had some time to kill because I was heading up north on essentially a vacation, kind of a working vacation. And I had a function that I wanted to be part of in Jupiter, which is about an hour and a half north of downtown Miami. And the function was in the late afternoon of the next day, and I was already up in Jupiter, so I had to spend the night there. And it's a pleasant place to spend the night, don't get me wrong. But I had some time to kill. So the next day, I was just driving around and passed a cemetery about maybe a half mile inland from the coast road there. And I just drove in, gate was open, and there were some people congregated outside the office of the cemetery. And one very well-dressed woman was greeting people, and I guess it was a bereaved party, I don't know. But I waited until she had a chance to talk to me, and I said, hey, I've got some time to kill, and we've got a very lovely little cemetery here. Actually, not that small. But I was just curious as whether there's any notable folks buried here. And she said, well, I don't know what you consider notable, but is Perry Como famous enough for you? I said, Perry Como? Perry Como's buried here? I figured he might be up in Ohio somewhere or something. That's where he's from. Started out as a barber. Can't remember his real name, but he settled on Perry Como for his stage name and had enormous success over the years. Never the kind of success that another more prominent crooner, Bing Crosby, had, but he had a fantastic career, and he had a big hit with that tune, You've Come a Long Way from St. Louis. Hardly the only one to perform it, by the way. Della Reese had a minor hit with it, and I think probably dozens of other people have recorded it over the years. It's something of a standard. But I was excited. In fact, when she said, is Perry Como famous enough for you? I said, you're talking about the guy who sang one of the great rhymes in all of pop music history. Let's see if we can get it out the first time right. How did it go? The times that we cheered whenever our team was scoring a touchdown. The day that the floor fell out of my car when I put the clutch down. Magic. Magic moments. You remember that? Big hit for him, I want to say in the 60s. I don't think it was as late as the 70s. But he was still recording and having minor hits when I started listening and imagining being a AM disc jockey, boss disc jockey that was in vogue back in the late 60s and early 70s. But his career was on the wane, and of course, now he's interred there in that little cemetery in Jupiter, Florida. Another reason Jupiter's of interest to me is because it happens to be the city where I last saw my brother. I've only got one sibling, had one. He was 5 years older than me, 6 years ahead in school, so we were not very close. But he was dying of ALS that he attributed to exposure to Agent Orange after he was drafted and spent a year in Vietnam. I missed the draft by being born in 1954. Lucky me. and unlucky for my brother. But because his wife happens to be his widow, I guess now, happens to be a big St. Louis Cardinals fan, and the St. Louis Cardinals do their spring training in Jupiter. Used to be St. Petersburg over on the west coast of Florida, but now it's Jupiter these days. So they were in town or in Jupiter for that, so I drove down to Jupiter to rendezvous with them. And this was back in, I guess, 2014, a few years before the thing at the cemetery. Well, anyway, the lady says, would you like me to take you out to Perry Como's grave? I said, are you kidding? You betcha. And also, I believe Gary Carter, was he a Mets superstar, the catcher? He's also buried in that same cemetery in Jupiter. And again, I was just killing time, and now I can say I've stood 6 feet from the late, great Perry Como, who has crooned our introductory theme, and I think we'll stick with it. I like that song, and I certainly like Perry Como. An interesting fact about Perry Como, he happens to be the seventh son, or he was when he was alive, the seventh son of a seventh son, which I always thought was some kind of a biblical thing. I thought it might be in the Old Testament or something, but no, I looked it up. It turns out it's a German folklore tradition, the seventh son of a seventh son. And I only know one other individual on the American landscape that can be said of. I'm sure there's many others, but only one notable one that I've ever seen identified as the seventh son of a seventh son. That would be the late Len Dawson, who was the losing quarterback, of course, in Super Bowl I against the Green Bay Packers. He quarterbacking the Kansas City Chiefs in that losing effort. And yes, I watched every single play of Super Bowl I. And in fact, I've seen every single play of every single Super Bowl. And in fact, one in person at the Rose Bowl there, and I believe it was 1987, when the Denver Broncos under John Elway got steamrolled by Phil Simms and the New York Giants. I was actually at that Super Bowl. Had to sneak in to get there, but I did. But all the others I've watched on television. You see, I have a certain passion about taking in the totality of the American experience to as great a degree as I possibly can. And that certainly includes watching every play of every Super Bowl. And I'll be tuned in this year. Who knows? Maybe it'll be down there. The Dolphins look to be having a promising season. And, well, I guess we don't have Brady with the Buccaneers in Florida anymore, and I don't even consider the Jacksonville Jaguars a legitimate NFL franchise, so I don't think much about them. But I certainly like the Dolphins and the the Buccaneers, and we'll see if any of them get anywhere near the Super Bowl in the postseason this year. Anyway, that's my Perry Como story, and I'm real flattered that you found a few minutes to devote to this edition of the Radioactive Take with me, Brian Steibel. And we'll do it again tomorrow. It's a Monday through Friday thing. We'll take the weekends off, but Monday through Friday, expect 10, maybe 15 minutes of commentary and just kicking around everything in and out of the news. There's no topics restricted. One of my slogans on the radio always was everything from astronomy to zoology. And we'll live up to it here on the Radioactive Take. One more time on the email address. It's radioactiveseattle@gmail.com. And I'm Brian Steibel. And that is a wrap for this edition of the Radioactive Take. But there's another one tomorrow. We hope you will tune in. In the meantime, thank you for your viewership, and over and out from Florida.